Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and fellows of the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Studies, Law as Culture. A very warm welcome to all of you, especially to Jan-Christoph Marschelke, who will give the lecture on this wonderful summer evening. And as you can see, I'm sitting just in the front of the castle between the students looking for this lecture. Jan-Christoph Marschelke studied law at the University of Passau and Würzburg and passed the second state examinations after working with civil and penal judges and town administration in Ludwigshafen, with labor lawyers in Heidelberg, at Springer Academic Publishing, and at the German Embassy in Athens, Greece. He did his PhD in legal philosophy on Jeremy Bentham. From 2009 to 2030, he managed the multidisciplinary project Global Systems and Intercultural Competence at the University of Würzburg. In 2010, he was a guest lecturer on human rights and intercultural communications at the universities of Jilin and Northeastern Normal in Changchun, China. Since 2014, he is postdoc researcher at and manager of the Institute of the Study of Culture and Collectivity at the University of Regensburg. He is a member of a research project on cosmopolitanism, justice, democracy, and citizenship without borders, based in Lisbon, Portugal, and on the Regensburg Research Network Mediterranean Studies on Island Areas. His main research areas are cultural and social theoretical perspectives on collectivity, interculturality, and the law. Ladies and gentlemen, in the year 1972, Pierre Bourdieu published his book Équisse d'une théorie de la pratique, starting point of a new theory which tries to combine two different traditions in sociology. The theory of action on the one hand, the theory of structures in society on the other hand. Well, this behavioral turn in action theory, as I call it for myself, had a major impact on the development of sociological thinking over the past few decades. We had to learn that we are always doing something, doing science, doing law, even doing nothing. Jan-Christoph Marschelke would like to connect collectivity and normativity via practice theory, and he will illustrate his approach by rereading his empirical research on social movements and ethnic boundaries. Just remark for the discussion, they are all constructed by doing collectivities, but it's social practice also a construction? Well, Jan-Christoph, now it's your turn to explain us the construction of constructivism.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here as a fellow at this colleague. I'm going to share my screen now with you. Doing collectivity, doing normativity. Maybe the first question that comes to your mind is why doing collectivity and why doing normativity? And the shortest possible answer is in order to avoid reification of concepts of collectivity, like group, organization, and concepts of normativity, like rule, norm, or value. Now, my talk will not be about this critique, so I'll summarize it very roughly. The critique of reification is addressed to academics, and it urges them not to use concepts like group or norm as if they designated a thing, a fixed object, an independent entity. Rather, it must always be clear that these concepts are shorthands for complex social processes made up of actions or practices. So collectivity is something we do, and so is normativity. But what is it then that we do, and how is it connected, and what happens if we try to think collectivity and normativity like that? That's what my talk will be about. Now I've really struggled with the decision how to start this talk. So how can I tell you the story of my project? I discarded like 20 ideas, and eventually I decided just to tell you the story of how I came about with my postdoc project, which is about doing collectivity. Yeah, and this story begins with a critique of the traditional concept of culture. So traditional concepts of culture, as in national or ethnic culture, convey the idea that there is a collectivity and that all the members of that collectivity share the same culture, and part of that culture are rules and norms. And according to this account, becoming a member of that collectivity entails acquiring that culture, be it as children or be it as immigrants. Now, the critique pointed out this entails an unrealistic homogenization of the members of that collectivity, and it conveys the impression that culture is something static. So people learn it, people live it, people pass it on to others, and nothing ever changes. On a conceptual level, we summarize these problems as reification. Now, in order to do away with this, Andreas Regwitz has proposed, let's not attach culture to collectivity, but to practice. So instead of national or ethnic culture, we can talk of the culture of vegan cooking or doing social sciences. Well, that's a good start, but there are several problems with that, and I'll mention only 5. Problem number 1. Some scholars have simply reattached practices to collectivity. So they spoke of typical German or typical working class practices. And okay, that just means that we are back to square one. Speaking of square one, problem number 2, we can also reify practices and convey the impression that vegan cooking or doing social science is the same thing no matter which time or place. Problem number 3, reproduction of practices, or in classical terms, socialization. The traditional nexus of culture and collectivity might have been bad, but at least it offered us a vague explanation of how culture is reproduced, because it intertwined membership within the collectivity with the acquisition of its culture. So on the one hand, if we leave out collectivity, we have to find a way how to conceive of the reproduction of practices within practices. But on the other hand, and that is problem number 4, I think most people would agree that we learn a lot of practices as members of collectivities, be it families, organizations we work for, friendship circles, sports teams, and so on. And problem number 5, aren't practices themselves a collective phenomenon, at least on 2 levels? So practices are not single acts of a single actor, but patterns of action performed by many practitioners across space and time. And second level, many practices like playing soccer or having a party are performed by a multitude of practitioners. So long story short, it seems we need collectivity. Problem only is, as said in the introduction, the concepts of collectivity have been accused of reification too. Think of Max Weber or Brubaker's critique of groupism. So what can we do? We just turn the tables by crafting a conception of practices of collectivization. Okay, easily said, but not that easily done, because practice theories are not without intricacies. And if you think of theories of collectivities, well, just consider the fact that even on an abstract level, the notion of collectivity may refer to categories, smaller groups, social movements, masses, organizations, and so on. This poses many challenges, and of course, I will not be able to address all of them in a satisfying manner. But for today, I want to make 3 theoretical explorations. So first, I'm going to explore a multidimensional concept of practice, which entails both a collectivizing and a normative dimension. And then the second exploration would be thoughts on how these 2 dimensions interact with each other, and moreover with a subjectivating dimension of practice. And the third exploration will be about what it means to take seriously multi-collectivity and the entanglement of practices. And so the structure of my talk will be like that. So from sections 2 to 4, I'll run you through these 3 explorations, and then I'll take quite some time to do analysis of an example from social movement studies in order to illustrate this approach. Okay, so let's start with exploration number 1. And I'll do so in 3 steps. Step number 1 would be, what does that mean, a multidimensional concept of practice? So practice understood like this would be a pattern made of the following dimensions. There's a bodily dimension, that is bodily movements. Then there is a sense-making dimension, that would be the cultural dimension. And you could say with some caution that these are the 2 most basic elements that somewhat define practices. Further dimensions of practices, things and artifacts are involved. There's a spatial and temporal dimension, an affective, discursive, and performative dimension, and they have a subjectivating, a collectivizing, and normative dimension. Now, what does it mean when I talk of dimensions? It means 3 things. First, that every practice has all of these dimensions, but second, to quite different degrees. So every practice may have a bodily dimension, even thinking, but of course, practices like dancing or playing soccer, in these practices, the bodily dimension figures especially prominent. And dimensionality means third, that all these dimensions are interdependent. So you can't have one without the other. Let's head to step number 2. What then are practices of collectivization? Well, to begin, as we just learned, when I'm talking of practices of collectivization, I'm addressing such practices in which the collectivizing dimension figures especially prominent. On an abstract level, we could say that these are practices which produce commonalities and thus differences. So, for example, categorizing, attributing, naming, refining too, inviting people, gathering, and so on. And it means that I'm addressing the corresponding sense-making, so cultures of collectivization. That is practical knowledge, knowledge that is to a large extent implicit and below the level of active consciousness. It is know-how about what that is, what it means, how it works, for example, being on a team, family, gender, nationality. If you like, you could say that cultures of collectivization pretty much covers what Benedict Anderson has called so catchily imagined communities. But there are 2 differences. First, Anderson's conceptual account is, let's say, more idealist and detached from action. In contrast, I've integrated imagined communities here into practice. And a second difference, Anderson applies the concept to every collectivity which goes beyond face-to-face level. In contrast, I apply my approach to every kind of collectivity, because I would argue that part of doing family or friendship are these cultures of collectivization too. So ideas about what that is, what it means, and how it is performed. Well, and just in order to give you an idea how further dimensions come into play, so we could say there's an affective dimension which could help us to grasp phenomena like feelings of solidarity or belonging, or a temporal dimension which covers collective remembering. Let me give you just a tiny impression of what I'm headed for with this, because I said in the first section, the traditional perspective on culture and collectivity goes like this. We take a collectivity, be it a nation, an organization, we take it for granted, and then we ask what kind of culture is emanating from this collectivity. So I'm proposing, let's start the other way around by saying when people collectivize, they draw from a repertoire of collectivization practices and cultures. And let me give you 3 examples. So first, we could say nationalism evolved towards the end of the 18th century, and then it spread. In other words, people were starting to collectivize in a new way by drawing on collectivization criteria gained from the spectrum of nationalist ideologies. Example number 2, only a little later, the idea of formal bureaucratic organizations gain influence. And after initial skepticism, more and more people started to believe that this must be the most efficient kind of organization. And the very traditional perspective in organization theory took such an organization for granted, and then it would ask, is there maybe something like an informal culture which undermines the formal setup of the organization? And again, I propose we say, first we have to state formal bureaucratic organizing is nothing but a specific and contingent practice and culture of organizing. Third example, this is where I thought of Mrs. Dedloff and her conference in autumn. Family models, so be it a clan, or be it the bourgeois model of small family with traditional roles, be it patchwork families or families with two homosexual spouses who adopt children. These are forms of doing family nourished by family cultures. Again, these are practices and cultures of collectivization. Well, and I'd say it is pretty obvious that there's a lot of normativity within each of these three examples. So let's move on to step number 3 and have a quick and even sketchier look at doing normativity. As a response to the critique of traditional accounts of norms and rules, practice theory injects normativity into practices. In my account, this means that normativity is a dimension of practice. So every practice has normative elements, but there are practices in which the normative element figures especially prominent. For example, adjudicating or moralizing. But what is it that praxeology is actually telling us about normativity within practices? Now, the problem here is that there is not that much literature on that topic yet. Yes, quite some praxeologists mention normativity, but rather in passing. For example, with Andreas Reckwitz, you could read that normativity is always a part of that implicit know-how which guides the practice. And of course, that's an important thing to state because it depicts normativity as something which is always at work and which works to quite an extent beyond our reflective grasp. Thus, it also provides an explanation why people might not abide with official norms. But of course, that's not enough to grasp the entirety of what the normativity of practices is about. So let's have a quick glance at the work of those scholars who have directed more attention to the role of normativity in practice theory. And for those interested, here's a little short list. And I'll break down their really sophisticated reflections on 4 simple statements. First, practices do have a telos, or in the words of Rouse, there's something at stake, which I think is already part of what is meant with the normativity of the implicit know-how. Second, it seems we can distinguish 3 kinds of normative elements in every practice. So how to correctly perform that practice, how to behave to co-practitioners, and then third, which value is attributed to the practice in comparison to other practices. Third statement, these normative elements are part of the performances of practices. So by performing the practice, they get mobilized, be it simply by doing things how they should be done, or by evaluating, criticizing, sanctioning co-practitioners. So performances are always something that is accounted for, a concept which is also used in ethnomethodology. Fourth statement, Joseph Rouse even goes so far to say that the normative dimension of practices is decisive for the empirical determination of practices. Why? To put it very simply, we account for performances of practices as being excellent or poor. And performances that are beyond excellent or poor will not count as belonging to that practice in question anymore. That means normativity gets intertwined with the intelligibility of practices. I'll leave it at that, but I hope you got both a vague idea of the direction which practice theory accounts of normativity are going and of how complicated it gets if we are trying to get to its social theoretical bottom. Okay, so let's move to section number 3 and let us intertwine quickly the dimension of collectivization, subjectivation, and normativity. So first question again must be, why is this important? And the answer is in order to solve that socialization problem. Thomas Alkemeyer and his research group have argued repeatedly that we should deepen the relationship between subjectivation theories and practice theories. And so we could say that practices have a subjectivating effect on its participants. What does that mean? We could say roughly it means learning by doing. In a double sense. On the one hand, it makes practitioners comply with the normative elements of practice. So normativity is already in here. And that's no surprise because this combination of subjectivation and normativity figures prominently, for example, in Judith Butler's work. And on the other hand, it means, and that would be an addition by more recent subjectivation theories, enabling and empowering people. So they learn to master a practice and they may learn to criticize and even transform. Okay, so far we linked subjectivation and normativity. And yes, that's a good starting point. But as Alkemeyer and colleagues themselves pointed out in a later publication, one flaw in classical subjectivation theories is they presuppose those social structures and collectivities which supposedly exert subjectivation effects on people. So yes, we all get subjectified in family and school, but family and school are collectivities. And we said we don't want to reify these concepts. So we need to couple subjectivation and collectivization too. That is to say, practices of collectivization and subjectivation take place at the same time. Now, probably the best example from classical sociological literature for the nexus of these three practice dimensions is that famous scene from Durkheim's Les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse, where he so vividly describes those rites which keep the imagination of the tribe alive and convey its normative force. But I chose for illustration something else, an everyday practice, and that is family dinner. So family dinner intertwines literally hundreds of normative interactions, like sit close to the table, don't wipe your mouth with the sleeve of your pullover, and of course, hey, you don't get up before everyone else is finished. We're having dinner together as a family. This is really the only time the entire day that we are all together. We can see family dinner has a subjectivating effect on participants, both on parents in their roles and children. It's soaking with normativity. And of course, it is an activity as part of practice of collectivization. So it is one of the many activities that contribute to the everyday reproduction of family. It's one aspect of doing family. So that would be a first quick illustration of the three dimensions work together, but don't worry, I'll have another one coming up. But before we come to that, let's move on to exploration number 3. Taking multi-collectivity and entanglement seriously. Again, why is this important? Answer, multi-collectivity is supposed to help us to avoid reification of collectivities, and entanglement helps avoid reification of practices. Or in one sentence, we need this in order to be able to grasp social complexity. So let's have a look at that. I guess you're all familiar with the basic idea of multi-collectivity. It means we are all members of a whole bunch of collectivities, be it abstract collectivities like gender, class, profession, age, race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, and so on. And we are members of many more concrete collectivities like family, friendship circles, sports clubs, teams at our workplace. And speaking of the workplace, we are part of organizations too, like a business company or maybe a religious community or church. And this implies two things. First, on the level of the single practitioner, it means that I participate in all the practices that produce these collectivities. And with regard to subjectivation, it means I get subjectivated in multiple ways. And this insight is pretty well known from the discourse on personal identities. Rather overlooked is a second implication which pertains to the collective level. And that is multi-collectivity means that collectivities are interwoven. So whatever we learn as part of collectivity 1, we transport to collectivity 2 and 3, at least on a latent or implicit level. So at our family dinner, Mommy might bring up topics from her workplace, the children tell from school class or kindergarten, and then daddy makes a sexist joke he heard, so he brings both friendship circle and gender categories to the table. Now, how can we bring together multi-collectivity and the idea that practices are always entangled with other practices? Well, simple. If we take doing collectivity seriously, multi-collectivity is nothing but the entanglement of practice of collectivization. It is multiple doing collectivity. And I think this pretty much captures the statement made by Roger Brubaker in his critique of groupism, where he wrote, categories need ecological niche in which to survive and flourish. So, for example, doing family is entangled with doing gender and doing age, as gender roles are both constitutive of family and transmitted and negotiated there. But to allude to Stefano Serla's project, legal categorizing provides such niches too. Okay, so much or rather so little on multi-collectivity and entanglement. So let me illustrate my approach by rereading an article from Research on Social Movements. But before doing so, I want to thank Diana Villegas, because we did a Zoom chat where we talked about our project, and I told her I was looking for illustration for this talk. And then later on, when I was commenting on her project, I brought up this article. And then I realized, yeah, of course, this is the article I can use for my talk. What I want to say is, it's a pity that we're having this colleague only digitally, but this was let's say, a colleague moment where just chatting about stuff gives you new ideas. So thanks, Diana. Okay, let's get to it. It's an article by Cristina Flecha-Fominaya, and she did empirical research among autonomous groups belonging to the wider global justice movement, which is a movement basically critical of capitalist globalization. And she followed 3 such autonomous groups in Madrid. First one is called La Consulta Social Europea. Second, Laboratorio de Desobediencia, that means Disobedience Lab. And third, Espacio Horizontal contra la Guerra. That means horizontal space against war. And of course, there are countless more such groups almost all across the globe. Now, before we set off, 2 remarks. First, of course, we could look at these practices as niches in the sense of Brubaker, in which an amorph and somewhat categorical collectivity like the global justice movement is produced and reproduced. But actually, this is not what I'm getting into, because I will take you into the story of these 3 collectivities. Before we do so, second remark, taking a praxeological perspective means that I'm not so much addressing these 3 groups as single units, but I'm addressing them as 3 instances or performances of a practice of collectivization, a practice that we could call, for shorthand's sake, doing autonomous group. Okay, with this in the back of our mind, let me start by quickly telling you Fominaya's story of these 3 groups. And she analyzes success and failure of these groups according to how collectivization worked out in 3 sides of collectivization. First, and of central importance, there's an assembly. Second, there's informal socializing, which usually took place around the assembly. And third, collective action. So concrete projects like organizing a demonstration or something like that. So, and the stories go like this. Let's start with CSE. Fominaya tells us, assembly initially worked pretty well. People felt welcome. Socialing worked great too, but they couldn't really decide on what to do, so they did little, and eventually people got frustrated and the assembly didn't work anymore. The group dissolved, or in other words, collectivity undone. Let's move to LD. Here, the assembly didn't work very well, because it became quickly dominated by a small elite who were dedicated to over-theorizing. And that led to fragmentation and socializing as well. But at least they managed to set up a memorable common action, and this kept LD alive for longer than expected. Last but not least, the ECHG. This was the most successful group. Why? I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Now let's go to my rereading. I'll start with some comments on the nexus of collectivization, normativity, and subjectivation. First, I illustrate the nexus of collectivization and normativity, and I will do so by commenting on the first meetings of the CSE, first group. As to doing collectivity, we can see, well, people do something. They invite others, they gather, they discuss, they take first decision, for example, they name the group, and so on and so forth. And these activities are held together by a specific culture of collectivization, which is the model of an autonomous group. And of course, just like family dinner, this model of collectivization is already soaking with normativity. Let me give you 6 examples. It implies first that you have to have open assemblies, so very little social closure. Second, you have to let everyone speak. Third, you have to decide consensually. Fourth, that there may be no representatives. Fifth, no influences from outward, especially not by political parties. And sixth, action is more important than theory. This normativity is mobilized and performed by, for example, the way an assembly gets organized as open assembly. But this normativity also manifests itself in forever ongoing discussions. In this case, it was about how to behave towards the institutional left, that is parties and unions. Because principle number 1, be open to everyone, and principle number 5, no influences, can get into conflict. And so, for example, some demanded that members of parties and unions should not be allowed to join the CSE. And eventually, this also affected principle number 6, because they discussed too much and didn't get things done. So that is, in my eyes, a very illustrating example of how collectivization and normativity are intertwined as to boundary making and membership, as to participation and decision making. And it shows that normativity is not so much determining action, but realized and debated and negotiated as part of the attempt to successfully perform autonomous group. Okay, so we connected normativity and collectivization. Let's bring subjectivation into the picture. Forminaya mentions that these groups were joined by some who had experience with doing autonomous groups and some who hadn't. And this may be helpful to understand the double idea of subjectivation. So the experienced ones had more competence, and by doing the assembly, they showed the newbies how that works, organizing an assembly according to the model of an autonomous group. So this is a form of intra-practice socialization. And by the way, it also shows that power is not equally distributed within practices. Now, if you look at the 2 aspects of subjectivation, here you can see the newbies, on the one hand, got positioned both as newbies and in order to learn how this thing is done, and they get evaluated, they have to learn to accept that everyone will come, be patient enough to let everyone speak, and so on. And of course, by doing so, they gained experience and competence. And this is important as we move on to the second part of my rereading, the role of multi-collectivity and entanglement. I just said the newbies in doing autonomous groups gained experience and competence. Now, according to Forminaya, one reason why the third group was more successful than the other 2 was simply this. Some of the members of the first 2 groups joined the third. And so having been subjectivated in doing groups 1 and 2 has made them learn what works and especially what does not work. I'll give you 3 more little examples. Example number 2. Multi-collectivity, of course, did not only occur in this way. So people are not only members of other autonomous groups too. Some of the members of CSE seem to have been members in the institutional left too. And we have already heard this may bring conflict as to the realization of autonomous principles, but it also brings access to resources. That was the case with CSE. But multi-collectivity can also evolve within the constructed boundaries of one collectivity. And that would be example number 3. We can see this especially in the second group. within LD, several other collectivities were produced. So there was that elite circle which started to dominate it, thus actually failing to correctly perform an autonomous group. And there were several small circles of confused members who felt oppressed by that elite. So doing LD was accompanied by doing of several further collectivities which fragmented LD. And this is also a good example of the fragility of doing collectivity. Last example, Forminaya provides us with the information on the names of the two first groups. So the first group used consulta as reference to the Mexican Zapatista movement, and the LD in contrast referred to the so-called disobedienti who had protested in Genoa in 2001 at the G8 summit. So we see another form of entanglement. You cannot only draw on the theorization of collectivities when you refer to the abstract model of autonomous group, but also by referring to concrete historical examples. I'll leave it at that with my illustration, and I'll head for the outlook. And actually, it's really nothing but an outlook. So I'll spare you with a summary. Instead, I've put 3 visualizations here, which remind you of what I have just put you through. And believe me, I've spared you with a lot of details from the discussion of practice theories too. So I want to finish with something else. I want to have a look at what lies ahead of me as part of my project here at the center. And I hope something of that I can present at the center's conference in July. So next thing I would like to do is bring together 2 tasks of my project. First, I would like to further systemize what I've presented today. So some analytical candidates I mentioned in passing are boundary making, membership, participation, decision-making, and joint actions. And second, I would like to connect my approach with a discourse on normative or legal communities, exemplified by Roger Cotterill. So to start with, we could say that Forminaya's 3 autonomous groups are normative communities, or even legal communities if you cherish strong legal pluralism. But to put it in more general terms, I would like to connect my approach with the one by Cotterill on both levels. So on the level concerning collectivity, I would like to compare the theoretical insights of how collectivities are produced and interconnected. Here, on the one hand, Cotterill relies more on a Weber, Anderson, Cohen tradition. So I would like to do some rereading from a praxeological perspective, which emphasizes multi-collectivity. And on the other hand, exactly this tradition enables Cotterill to distinguish communities according to the Weberian ideal types of Bestimmungsgründe. So in his account, there are communities in which the collective involvement is mostly instrumental, like business companies, in which the collective involvement is mostly based on belief, like in religious communities, or on tradition, or on affectivity. And it will be interesting to think about whether from a praxeological perspective this can be helpful to adapt, or whether it is rather misleading or theoretically incompatible. And on the normative level, 2 explorations might be interesting. First, Cotterill discusses the role of trust and authority. And such features have been widely missing in my presentation today, but of course, they are central if we want to understand in which way doing collectivity is connected to the validity of the normative elements. And second, I really like Cotterill's idea of decentralizing the state. So as just another network of normative or legal communities, a network which tries to colonize other legal communities, be it families, churches, or autonomous groups, and vice versa. And I also like the idea because this will take the idea of entanglement of practices of collectivization right into the heart of legal sociology. So right to the question, how may social life be regulated by something that we call, in a very refined manner, the law? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan-Christoph, for this inspiring talk. I have a lot of questions related to classical sociological questions, concepts of dynamic and multifactorial collectivities, like only to refer on the classic Simmels term of Vergesellschaftung, Elias, Figuration, Goffman's ensemble, and others. But I think there are many other questions and comments. Now, please, the floor is open. Who will start our discussion? Daniel Witte, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Jan. That was highly interesting, and as Clemens Albrecht already stressed, of course, through sociological in substantial terms. But I also like the formal side of it, how you guide your audience through this argument, which I kind of rather know from another discipline, not jurisprudence, interestingly, but maybe from philosophy, although you give it a certain characteristic twist. Anyway, thanks a lot. I have a few questions, and I try to be brief. That touch on the foundations of your model. At first, I thought you're already smuggling normativity into the concept of practice, which is a clever move, so to speak. And then I understood what you mean by it. You mentioned three dimensions of normativity of practice, namely the classical know-how or know-how to. Secondly, the know-how to treat the co-practitioners or this community of practice. And thirdly, a way of attributing value to practices. But of course, normativity in a general sense mostly addresses other questions, namely things which are in a very broad way related to rule following in the sense of obeying to normative expectations and so forth, which is not included in the three dimensions of normativity that you stressed. The question then remains, in my opinion, where these normative expectations come from and how you import them into your model. I have the feeling that this might either lead much closer to the conventional approach that you reject in the beginning, or into an infinite regress once you take that problem seriously. And this is, in a certain way, this is related, if you look at these practices of collectivization, related to what we could call a Durkheim paradox, namely the paradox of organic solidarity, a classical critique of his work on the division of labor, namely the idea that this kind of solidarity rests on a form of collectivity which is not explained at all, right? Or already needs solidary preconditions to evolve itself. One solution to that problem, a classic solution, and you know I have a Bourdieusian background in parts. One solution to that problem is to draw on a concept of structure at the same time, and I'm aware that you're drawing on different kinds of practice theories here mainly, but you deliberately do not import a strong concept of structure here. But if you refrain from doing so, you always have to answer the question, where do these norms come from? And this is the regress problem mainly. You mentioned the family table, of course, people have to sit close to the table, but where do these expectations come from and why do they differ, for example, in cultural comparisons? Also, why do they differ from political expectations, as you mentioned in your second example? How do we, a concept of field, for example, could explain where different norms exist in the family and in the political field. But once you refrain from using such a concept, you have to explain their existence without dissolving this entire model in a process which necessarily does not have a beginning and an end and so forth. This is the regress problem mainly. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I hope you understood my points where I'm intrigued and would like to learn more. Thank you again.
Of course, these are central questions, and let me start with the second by simply saying this is an aspect I left deliberately out. To be honest, I'm still, let's say, not decided between an approach that tries to reconstruct structure or other macro phenomena just as complexes of practices, and the other possibility would be to, let's say, okay, we have practices and we learn a lot from practice theory, but we need these concepts of structure or discourse as well. There's a lot of discussion in practice theory on the relation between discourse and practices. So, of course, this is an important question. When I say I'm not decided which way to take, it is really like if we want to have a, let's say, a theory which can be operationalized for empirical research, probably the easier way to go right now is to take practice and then some structural terms as field, for example, as well, and proceed with this. I always like to think of theory as a thought experiment as well. So it would be nice to try to, where are we getting at if we really try to think all these macro phenomena in terms of complexes of practices. This actually is, this leads to your first question as well, because something I didn't manage to say is that for these questions about, let's say, as you said, classical questions from legal sociology, rule following and such stuff. This, as far as I can see, is solved in these practice theoretical approach to normativity by very much emphasizing the entanglement of practices. So if you, for example, read that article by Susan Wagerecht from the Berliner Journal of Soziologie from last year, she will take you, for example, to that old example by Heinrich Popitz, what it is to come at the crossroads and see the traffic lights and then react to the traffic lights. She would try to reconstruct this by saying that there are a lot of practices entangled with each other. So yes, there is a regulating practice, which once declared that we are having like traffic lights and they have a certain meaning. There are practices of planning how traffic in city is going on. So they put the traffic lights right there where it is now. There are practices of engineering that have to develop such a traffic light and so on and so forth. So I put it in a very abstract way. This is the attempt to show how, let's say, if you like to say how from outside of a practice, something like normative expectation is imported into a practice. That's basically the idea. So question back, does that help at least a bit?
Yes, it sure does. I mean, maybe the interesting provocation from some kinds of radical practice theory currently is to put in question the very idea of rule following, right? So this conventional sociological understanding of there is a normative expectation and people orient themselves towards it may be flawed from the get-go. This is kind of the provocation, and maybe some things happen that we then may call ad hoc normative oriented action or practice, and let's change the entire perspective. And I wonder how far you would go into this direction. This is part of the background of the question, so to speak.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a bit like if I take the narrative by Thomas Alkemeyer and collectives, it would be really like saying a little bit, okay, we have a more, let's say, structural camp in practice theories, and probably they would go into the direction that I sketched with Reckwitz to say this is implicit normative stuff, And we are, let's say, like we are following rules without knowing that there are rules. We just learn to do things, we do it, and thus we perform normative elements which are implicit. Now, when I mentioned things like criticizing, evaluating and stuff, I would say this is maybe a little contribution to what Alkemeyer and colleagues call the more ethnomethodological camp in practice theory. So they would try to more import these insights because criticizing, giving account of what we are doing, of course, is central in ethnomethodology. And so this is maybe the attempt to not only focus on this argument that we are actually following rules without following rules.
Thank you. Werner Gebhardt, please.
Thank you very much for your beautiful talk. And it certainly helps me to get a better understanding of practice theorizing. However, excuse me for asking this question, where and to what extent it really goes beyond a classical action theory. First, my suspicion is that the use that Bourdieu made of pratique, first in, I think, systematically in Le Sens Pratique, is that action theory is not possible in the intellectual French context. That's only a, so to say, a contingent argument for a certain practice in thinking the social, une habitude de penser le social in the French context. But let us take more concrete examples of action theory. Of course, in Weber, it is clear the state is only the chance that a certain type of behavior takes place and is not a compact entity. Other elements that you stressed as being a strong argument for practice theory is you can formulate without any kind of problem within the action theory frame of reference, or by using the phenomenological tradition, I would say, implicit knowledge, implicit normativities, etc. I don't have a problem with that. However, you prefer to speak in practice, and you have absolutely the right. I do not want to say you should not do that. But please explain me once again, and perhaps so that I am convinced in the end, and I will change my paradigm. Of course, if it is a better one, more useful for explaining empirical phenomena, more direct, more so more useful simply as a tool, as ein Werkzeug. It's nothing than this. It's not no ontology behind. Of course, that's why I'm completely open. I would like to be convinced, and please try to do that. And let me take a last example. Is it not just when you take the differentiation between office and office holder, Amt und Person, in the tradition of discussing modernity, and even in your terms, doing modernity, there is exactly the exemption of practice that makes the office independent of the office holder, what we can observe in Cologne rather close. Das Amt wird nicht beschädigt dadurch, und das Amt ist ausfüllbar, und es ist Gnadenspendung möglich. Das wird uns Judith Hahn is able to explain it much better from the perspective of canon law. But this is exactly because a certain practice does not play any role for the evaluation, the normative orientation towards a certain institutional context. So those were my 3 remarks, and I will be very glad to be convinced to change my life from now on. Intellectual life, of course. Doing theory. in your terms?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. And yeah, will I now be able to convince you? The problem is that I have to convince parts of myself as well. Because, okay, let me start like this. When I said in the very beginning that we want to say always doing, I said that this is in order to avoid reification, and if you want to avoid reification, you can resort to action theory as well. So the question basically is, why praxeology and not action theory? I can, well, let's say, resort to very abstract arguments that would be like, probably well known that praxeologists accuse the action theory of methodological individualism, of idealism, and stuff like that. So eventually they are living in overcome dichotomies and so on and so forth. But I don't want to take it there, because actually I think the question which is really posed by action theory is, so what about, let's say, something like rational choice? Isn't that something that we do? If we take practice to be like more of that, something like what in older accounts has been called a habit or a custom, or I don't know. Well, isn't deliberate action something that we do? And to be honest, I don't find this question so easy to answer. So one way to solve this would be like go to Bourdieu and ask for strategies. I find that a nice idea, but as far as I know, I'm not a specialist in Bourdieu, but I've read several times that strategy is really a very difficult element in Bourdieu's theory. So the question arises: is that really compatible with all the rest of his account? Now, another option would be, I think, for example, Stefan Hirschauer likes that option. That's to say, we have different concepts for different, let's say, levels of how explicit we are about things and how we're doing things and from which perspective we have to look at things. That would be another possibility. As I said, I'm not absolutely decided on which way to go. I like, for example, the idea, and I think this is, in my eyes, what praxeology really does. I would say that the old concepts of habit and custom were really like besides other ideas, like there's habit and there's action and so on and so forth. Now, the praxeology, for example, this is, I think, very well described in this praxeological sociology of knowledge. To say this is the primordial form of sociality. So even if somebody is, let's say, doing deliberation, there's so much stuff underneath it, which in this moment is not reflected, is not explicit. So there is no rational choice, no classic action without this fundament of stuff that we can explain with praxeology. This would be, let's say, an argument which I find pretty convincing. But of course, it doesn't solve the question posed by some: if is everything we do in the end practice, or are there other activities which need other concepts in order to get really well analytically grasped? Okay, that was. Were these two of the three remarks? I'm not too sure.
The third one was with relation to a practical example, namely
office and office holder.
Abstraction of practice as a practice, if in your terms, of the Catholic Church.
What I find decisive and what I have to admit that even in my talk, I had to be very careful to not exchange the performance of a practice, which can be bad, with the practice itself.
Okay.
I think this might help. And of course, if we're going to something like office, we could go again at institution, and then we could go again as a complex of practices, if we like. I'm still like thinking that through if I like it.
Okay, perhaps the next speaker will be able exactly to solve this kind of problem of canon law. But thank you very much for your explanations, and we have to follow up our discussion at the latest tomorrow morning.
So first time Judith Hahn, do you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, but I'm not able to solve any problems here, I guess. Now, I just have a question. I was wondering, I thank you very much for the fascinating talk, for it really fascinating. And I was wondering, you see my limited view on the matter, from my point of view, I was wondering how many parallels there are with ritual theory and with what ritual theorists think about the ritual as, Roy Rappaport once said, the ritual as the basic social act. Basically doing ritual as a practice of doing normativity. And also, I think you used the expression normativity negotiated. Basically ritual as a practice where normativities, they are there and then they are questioned and discussed, and some are reinstated and some are overturned, and so on, new ones developed. So I was just wondering, but that's, you see, it's just my limited view on the matter of whether there's maybe a major parallel, for example, with an approach like Roy Rappaport's with regard to rituals and their connection with normativity, and how rituals in doing normativity also create community or do community, individual identity, and so on. It's basically the act, the ritual act, that brings about all these concept. I think you don't like the word, but you know what I mean. It creates community, creates identity, creates the normative, recreates it, and so on. I was just wondering about that parallels, if there's something about that.
Definitely. I think there are many parallels between what, on the one hand, practice theory does and what some ritual theories have already theorized before, like Victor Turner, for example. Actually, Anthony Cohen, who did this work, symbolic construction of community, and to whom Cottrell refers, has drawn a lot of Turner and on rituals. So I'd say some of this lies ahead of me. I don't want to leave it really at that. The question would then be, is there something like a special feature of rituals which we cannot, which are more than just practice? And my intuition is yes, there is. But I have to admit, in order to really determine what it is, if there's something that needs to be, let's say, reconstructed or put in another way in comparison to the quite sophisticated theories of rituals, I'm not too sure. Because, I mean, what I know about ritual theories that are, let's say, not old, there's so much stuff within it which I have mentioned as well. Like, yeah, of course, there's a lot of things that people just do, and by performing, they really adapt to it. So that is a subjectivation process that takes place. But then, of course, they've added that there might be conflict or negotiation within the ritual. So when I talked about this on normativity, okay, we are on the same line there. So again, long story short, very good question, and that lies ahead of me. I think there's a lot of parallels, but the intuition would be that there's something that ritual theory would still add to it.
Okay, Nina Detloff, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jan Marschelke, for this really very fascinating talk. I think you gave us deep insight into your multidimensional concept of practices. And not surprisingly, I would like to apply it to your ideas of doing collectivity, of doing normativity to the realm of families that you have mentioned repeatedly during your talk. And you describe the normative expectations, participation, the belonging, and so forth within the family, where the doing of family really has been in family sciences become a concept during the last maybe 20 years, I would already say. So when you focus, especially what I find interesting, on new forms of family, where new normativities might come into existence, they're like step families, for example, or you already mentioned the same-sex families. To what extent do the legal norms play a role in this doing collectivity and doing normativity? In those family forms, in the new family forms, but on the whole, because who belongs to the family or to this community, to this collectivity, is to a large degree shaped by legal norms as well. Who, for example, take it the step family, the step parent relationship, or also the co-mother, whether there is a legal relationship recognized, or what the decision-making powers are. So the question that I'm puzzling with is what the legal norms, what kind of role they play within your concept. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this somewhat takes us back to Daniel's comment. But of course, this is a very nice example, because just simply because doing family might for many people be like something, the most primordial thing that there is. And actually, if you're looking to it from another angle, you could say that this is like the most regulated connectivity there is from the legal point of view. Again, it would be it would have to be solved via the idea of entanglement of practices, like how these things get in contact with each other. So, of course, the question is, which are the mechanisms? One of the mechanisms that is cited repeatedly is, for example, translation. So the idea how different practices get into contact with each other. And that would be what has to happen here too, if you want to show how practices of legal regulations are entangled with doing family. And well, I don't want just repeat what you said, because from marriage to having children to dying and inheritances, everything is regulated. And yeah, that's that. So entanglement is again the way how to approach it from this praxeological perspective.
Thank you. Daniel Witte again.
Just a short remark on this discussion between Werner Gebhardt and Judith Hahn and you, Jan. From my perspective, the answer to the question is pretty simple, because both highly structured rituals and action, as defined by different kinds of action theory, we would say, namely subjectively meaningful action, intentional action, or even rational action, and so forth. They all constitute individual special cases of what practice theory looks at. And there's a lot of more things happening in the world of practice theory than those things that action theories and ritual theories are able to address without distorting these phenomena. This is kind of the way I would address this. And regarding, I have a second question regarding your last comment, Jan. I was wondering what role ideas of hybridity play in your conception? Because you talk about entanglements a lot, but you have to entangle rather pure separated entities by doing so. And I would maybe suggest starting one step earlier with entangling these. You know what I'm asking for. What role does that play for you?
Yeah, I've learned to not like hybridity as a concept because it presupposes that there are like pure entities that get mixed up, while the idea would be to say it's from the beginning, it's nothing but a mixture. But again, you got me there on the entanglement. Yes, you got me there. It's like in the book published by Elizabeth Schoff, Alison Hui, and Theodor Schatzky in 2017 on practice theory. So there would be a whole article by Davide Nicolini on, well, should we say they are entangled? Should we say they are interconnected? Should we say practices intersect? Or is there a nexus? Is there a web? What is the best way of how to describe how they are brought into, let's say, contact with each other? In the end, I think if I got you right, you allude to a very basic problem, which is, or let's say, seemingly a basic problem, which is, where are the boundaries of a practice? I have a colleague who very openly says, and I'm quite sympathetic to this, where you would like them to end. This is where practices end. It's an analytical tool. You have to see what you do with it. Of course, maybe this is a little bit let's say, overemphasized, but in the end, then the question is, let's say, combining the observer's perspective with the participant's perspective in a way that creates a plausible description, narrative.
Thank you. Werner Gebhardt.
I don't want to monopolize, but very shortly, I think the very interesting question seems to be, how does it come that from doing you come to something you say that it ought to be done? So the old question from the philosophy of law, how habits become obligatory, where does it come from that a certain kind of doing family, monoparental family structures, for example, become accepted in a legal system? That is the point that is interesting to me. And the Durkheimian paradigm of family sociology just spoke of family life, la vie de la famille. And this led to certain forms, and the forms are, so to say, condensated in legal practices and in legal normativities. So I think we can't escape those old questions when just taking practice theorizing as a kind of way to express those problems. But don't misunderstand me, it is not in order to misrespect this approach, but I think we come back to the very old questions, however.
Yeah, it's not like I don't have that impression. I do have this impression too. Right now, as you were commenting, I thought, for example, of raising children with my little boy, for example. Like, I can see that he knows that he shouldn't do something. He's like watching out. Is somebody watching? He can, I'd say, he can feel my glance if it's there. And it's really like, you could say, he has incorporated a lot of this normative stuff before really understanding it. And later on, of course, we try to explicate why we don't want you to do this. But in the beginning, this is what the textbook says. Say to your child that you don't want her or him to do it because you don't want that it's done. Because it doesn't understand the reasons, but it really likes you and it wants to do what you want until a certain age. So practice theory doesn't necessarily gives us the clues to such processes. But I think, and this is what I'm trying to hint at with this multidimensional concept, it's like practice theory has like an octopus. It says, oh, we need materiality, we need body. Oh, we need affectivity. Oh, we need all the stuff, performativity, subjectivation. We need it all. It must all be into practice. And of course, you can overload concepts, no question. But I feel like there is a lot of integration potential coming from this direction in order to maybe get better accounts of some of the processes that are still lacking with regard to how normativity is getting from A to B too. I don't know if this somehow helps with the question.
Yes, Vela.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. First of all, my internet connection is unstable, so I might be interrupted or I might freeze in the next second. So you will show me if that is the case. I was fascinated by your analysis of collectivities and normativities, doing normativities. I am speaking as an outsider, of course, and I cannot comment on the analytical perspective of your presentation. I would be interested for a moment in a more strategic perspective of members of such collectivities. I think we all observe situations in which members of groups of collectivities try to reinforce this kind of community and take action in some way or another. A word that comes to my mind is a form of othering, and maybe that is something you might be willing to put into context under your analysis. And another point that comes to my mind is creating new communities, if I use this term correctly, when it comes to the self-empowerment of minorities, of victim groups, and these, if I may address them as such, new forms of communities, try to establish an entirely new form of normativity. I would call it as such, at least. So we are seeing new forms of gendering language. There are incidents where Black young ladies present a poem, and then the question comes up whether it should be translated, and all of a sudden the normativity is on the table that this should be done only by a person of the same, how can I say that, identity or same collectivity, maybe even. I'm sure I'm using these terms in a kind of naive and wrong way from your perspective, but I'm just trying to approach this kind of strategic perspective from the individual that may be supported, at least criticized and commented by your profound analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think again, I feel like you're asking me, okay, yeah, and you did a lot of conceptual and theoretical stuff. Now start to apply it, please. And it's really like, let's say, to comment on the strategic aspect, that takes us back a little bit to the question, which is the relationship to action theory, or do we need concepts like strategy, which I think I want this perspective as kind of what I'm doing, because I find it, this is something that I found very fascinating when I discovered, let's say, the discourse on nationalism theories, let's say, like many different ways of explaining how, for example, elites were trying to overthrow l'ancien regime or the colonial powers by strategically employing nationalist ideologies in order to mobilize people, in order to make them, get them to see them for some time as a we, to see a commonality which before they hadn't seen. So this is something which I find very attractive, and I want to apply my approach to this, and I need something like a concept of strategy in order to do this. Of course, I would always, as I said before, debate how far can we take the concept of strategy like this. So I would always say there's a primordial fundament to that, a fundamental praxeological fundament. But on top, yes, there is something like strategy and like diffusing certain practices and cultures of collectivities, which is exactly, if you refer to something like minority politics, identity politics, this is what people do. They are doing collectivity, they are employing collective categories in order to mobilize people, in order to get a better position in a certain field, to put it in Bourdieu's terms. And so yes, this is how I would try to approach it, but I certainly need like this strategy too. Yeah. But overall, all the examples you named, this is what I would say, these are activities who are part of practice of collectivization. The authenticity debate, of course, is something like that too. And even though all of you have worked out pretty well that I have some work ahead of me, I would say there is a lot of normativity in any kind of this collectivization practice. I hope this somehow.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think strategies played an important role in your own examples of the social movement groups when they learn from each other how doing collectivity works. But I have just a simple epistemological question. From your starting point, requits, why does culture, state, people, actions, and all these concepts reify but not practice? What's the difference?
I'm not sure that I will have a satisfying answer to that, but I would try to answer it like that, saying like, okay, if we look to the infinite regress argument by Wittgenstein, then it would be like, okay, we cannot, so in Wittgenstein, it would be like, we always have to interpret a rule, and then we need a second rule, so we need another rule to interpret that second rule, and so on and so forth. So we can't say in the end that it's rules that guide the action. And the idea by Wittgenstein is, at some point it stops. This is how we do it. That's it. So that would be like the idea. Maybe we could say, this is what practice stands for. This is how we do it. So it's like saying this question at that point is already answered by the concept. But this is just a tentative answer.
Isn't it the same with action? Action stops and we do it. Point.
Depends on how we understand action. If action is really that, this idea as in rational choice theories, that it's deliberate.
No.
No.
Rare in a sense. Even you have a whole complex of actions very near to the term of practice.
Yeah, of course. I would say that I think I'm not sure with regard to this, but I think many of the differences between Weberian accounts and praxeological accounts run along these lines of, post-structuralist and postmodern critique of Weberian action theory, so of neo-Kantianism and things like that. And I've put it once in some, I think, a book review. I put it like this before. So you can probably put the same things that you explain with praxeology, you can explain very well in terms of action theory, only if you don't like the idealist ring to this latter one, you might better refrain from it.
If there is an idealist ring. But we can discuss tomorrow, perhaps, such special sociological questions. Any further remarks, questions, comments? Werner Gebhardt?
It might be interesting for this nice crowd. We have in action theory, of course, one major problem. That is, we think in terms of individual actions, that we have where we have difficulties to define what's the beginning, what's the end of the action. And as action theory has been derived from the penal theory of Handlungstheorie with Radbruch, and Weber is referring to Radbruch, we have not the same possibilities as in penal law to define what an action is, and that must be imputed to an author and must be punished in the end. So we have complex situations of actions. We have, and to name this practices could make sense. Parsons calls it action systems, for example, or action complexes, I would say, for example. Or so I think there is a question of nomination and perhaps not of ideological or theoretical fundamental differences behind. And so much the more the question arises, why do we choose to use this or that kind of vocabulary? I don't want to go too much back to strategic arguments of how to implement a certain paradigm in a certain context, historical situation, etc. But however, I think it might be interesting for those who are interested in action theory that there are, in any case, strong relations between action theory traditions from rational theory to traditionally culturally grounded action behaviorism, etc., and to the idea of practice as a complex of different types of actions, perhaps, that may be part of the life world and a social sphere or a social system, and so to say, also an abstraction of what is going on in a certain type of life, I would say. But there also we have to make the distinction between the abstract idea, analytical idea of practice and the real practices, empirical practices in social life that do construct institutions, for example, that do stand for a state, that do stand for police in corona times, etc. So I think this might be also a further point for discussion. We might lead tomorrow. Excuse me, that was once again too long, and it was not really to make in doubt in any kind this wonderful talk. Thank you.
Okay, the last word of this evening belongs to Jan Marschelke. Do you want to give us a summary of your impressions of our discussion or something like this?
Well, I think it's obvious that the questions like how do the macro phenomena come into play in your account or in my account? What are mechanisms of entanglement, and what is the relationship with action theory? That's basically three tasks. It's three central topics in practice theory discussion as well. Actually, I had it on the last slide, but I put it off the slide. I don't need that on the slide because I have you as an audience. Merciless, put it back on the table. Thank you a lot for that. It was a very inspiring discussion, and yes, I think you'll have me grilled tomorrow on the fellow meeting on these points again.
No, but
very last remark, sorry, is Cottrell, by the way, will be part of our conference in 3 weeks and a half. He will be there with us and discussing. You mentioned him several times. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk and for the discussion. We can continue tomorrow in our fellow meeting. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.